Bow, bow, bow. Checking sound levels. Yeah. Nobody to love you. Nobody to care. I've had that song stuck in my head all day. All right. Here we go. So sorry. So sorry. And yet I am not sorry. I am not sorry because I am embodying the topic of our conversation today, which is Uranus. And Uranus don't give an F about F. So, yeah, let's get into it. This is the Zenith Glow Astrology Podcast, and my name is Christina, and I want to thank you so much for tuning in and for sticking with me these past 51 seconds. You easily could have abandoned ship, and I probably would have if I were you. So thanks for sticking with me, and I promise it'll get better. So yeah, we're going to talk about Uranus because oh my goodness, I recorded an entire first podcast all about 2025. And as I was recording it, just kept thinking like I feel like I'm forgetting something right now. I feel like something really important is escaping my attention right now. But I was very focused on talking about Aries and Neptune and Saturn and Pisces and the melding of those two things and water and fire and all the things that I discussed in that podcast. And I was very nervous because it was my first podcast. And I just completely blanked on Uranus. And then, sure enough, a couple days later, Uranus came jolting into my awareness as it tends to do, which we'll talk about. And I realized, holy shnikes, I didn't talk about Uranus in 2025. And that is a horrible, horrible mistake because Uranus is very, very important in 2025. So we're going to talk about that today. As an apology to Uranus, as an homage to Uranus, we're going to dedicate this entire episode to talking about Uranus. What is the function of Uranus? What are its archetypes? And then what is the significance of Uranus moving into Gemini, which it is going to do in 2025, which is the thing that I forgot to mention in that first podcast. So let me be a living testament to imperfection. Let's see. I'm going to pause this real quick. Okay. What the hell? Normally what I do when I record these podcasts is I will record a few minutes of sound and then I will listen back to make sure that the sound levels are okay and that there's nothing crazy going on. And right now I'm feeling like I just need to roll with this because I'm in a good mood and the information is flowing, which is again a Uranus thing. So this is a huge risk that I am taking. So we'll see. I might record this whole thing and be like, F. I gotta redo the whole thing, which is fine. It's fine if that happens. It's meant to happen if it does. All right. Uranus. So Uranus has been in the sign of Taurus since, I believe, 2020. And which is very significant. Or maybe it was 2019 when it started to go into it. So it's been there for, the past 5 years almost now, and which is about the time that it takes Uranus to transit a sign. It takes about 5 to 6 years. So it's one of those outer planets. Yeah, it's got a collective impact on us, and it's got an individual impact on us, just like the other outer planets. So Uranus and Taurus, you know what? Honestly, we're going to talk about Uranus and Taurus as it gets a little bit closer to when it's time for it to move into its first station in Gemini. Because at that point, it will be crossing the anaretic degree of Taurus, and that's going to be very significant. It's going to highlight those themes for us, and we're going to feel an intensification of that energy during that time. But today is all about Uranus in Gemini. What's really interesting about this podcast episode is this information was largely downloaded when I was between sleeping and awake, when I was in the theta state. I had all these ideas come to me. And then today, I actually had another piece of the message that was delivered by listening to someone else's video talking about something totally unrelated or seemingly unrelated to Uranus, but it completely sparked the missing piece of the puzzle for me. And I will talk about that when we get to it. But first, let's talk about Uranus. So Uranus is going to move into Gemini on July 7th, 2025. Now, because of its retrograde cycles, it's going to go into Gemini until November 7th, 2025. And then it's going to move back into Taurus until 2026. So it doesn't officially station in Gemini until 2026. But in 2025, we get the first segue, the first dip, the first taste of Uranus in Gemini. And because it's crossing that 0 degree, and 0 is as well as 1 degree, 0 is an intensification of energy, it's an amplification of energy. We're going to be feeling this very intensely. It also happens to be correlating with some other transits going on around that summertime period. So double whammy, triple whammy, quadruple whammy. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But first, let's talk about the archetype of Uranus. Uranus is our first outer planet when we move beyond the realm of Saturn. So it's the closest outer planet to us. And it is, and this isn't including Chiron. Chiron and Chariklo are kind of their own thing, and I just talked about that in my last podcast episode if you want to check that out. But in terms of the traditional astrological planets, which is a funny thing to say because Uranus is not traditional by any means, it is the first outer planet that we reach just beyond the realm of Saturn. So in this sense, Saturn represents the delineation of our consciousness. It is the barrier of our consciousness as it is confined or limited at that Saturn line before we extend into the outer planets, and which represent the superconscious or beyond linear consciousness. Saturn is all about linear reality, and it governs our physical reality, the 3D. And of course, there are positive and negative aspects to Saturn, and we're going to get into that, just like with any planet. But Saturn especially. Saturn especially has been intentionally amplified in its shadow aspects in our dimension, in our realm of existence. And we'll talk about that. But Saturn represents the barrier between the conscious and the superconscious. And so and so Uranus is the first planet that we reach beyond the realm of Saturn. And therefore, Uranus brings in information from the outer realms into our consciousness. And it is also tied into Mercury, okay? Because Mercury represents our conscious mind, our linear ways of thinking, our logic, and the way that our rational mind works. Uranus is the higher octave of Mercury. It is the higher mind. It is beyond the linear conscious mind. And so, because it's an outer planet, the outer planets always act on the inner planets rather than the other way around. I mean, to a degree, we could say as above, so below, and vice versa. But for the most part in astrology, when you're interpreting planets and the way that they act on each other through transits or through the lunation cycle in your natal chart, we look at the outer planets as acting through the inner planets. And so Uranus acts on Mercury, and it delivers information from the higher consciousness, from the superconscious, from the unconscious, from the, we could even say, etheric realms, the genius, the creative collective genius of Source. And it takes that information and that insight and it delivers it to Mercury. Uranus is incredibly fast moving. It is like electricity. And so because it is so fast, we often feel these like jolts. It's often it's considered to be a very shocking kind of planet. It's an upsetting planet in the sense that it's unexpected. So when it acts on Mercury, it's like it's so fast that Mercury can't process it in this linear way. It's like Uranus is quantum, right? It's not happening in linear time. It's happening multidimensionally. And Mercury has to like take all that information and somehow funnel it through this tiny little scope of linear reality and rational thought and logical consciousness. So often when we experience Uranus transits, they come through as flashes of insight. That's like a very classic association with Uranus's influence on us. And it is true. It's because it's functioning so fast that we can't like grasp it in a whole picture kind of sense. It takes time for Mercury to sort out what the hell Uranus is talking about. And so Uranus as an archetype, it is the ruler of Aquarius, and it represents rebellion and individuality and truth and originality, and it is symbolic of breakthrough and revolution, and it wants to advance our growth at any cost. At any cost, it wants to advance our growth. And so we see a juxtaposition between Saturn and Uranus in particular, because Saturn is like the antithesis to Uranus, or vice versa. Saturn is all about setting boundaries. It's all about limitations. It's all about structure and bringing things into form. It wants to crystallize things. Saturn is all about tradition, and it is all about social norms and functions, and it is all about conditioning each of us to fall within a certain set of parameters that have been established that are associated with being accepted by our current cultural norms and societal expectations. That's all Saturn stuff. Societal expectations. You know, this is the role that you play based on the labels you've been assigned. And if you want to fit into society, you have to conform to said roles, to said functions and labels in the way that society expects you to. And when you do that, what you get in return is security, and you get acceptance by society, and you can feel good about yourself because you're part of the group, you're accepted, you're sort of like one of the many. The problem, and so that's a good thing. That can be a good thing. I'm not saying it's always a good thing, but it can be a good thing because to a degree we need to be grounded, and we do need to have a place. We need to have a sense of purpose, and we do need to be able to function within this world in which we live. So to that degree, we need Saturn. But the problem with this is that Saturn crystallizes to the point that it inhibits our growth. We become too crystallized. We can't move beyond the parameters and the limitations that it has set for us. There are specific boundaries in place that are set by Saturn, and at some point, they precede our growth. So this is where Uranus comes in, because Uranus is all about advancement. It is all about breakthrough. It is all about progression, and it is all about freedom. So we can see how this is the antithesis to Saturn, because Saturn is like the restriction of freedom, and Uranus wants total uninhibited free expression, freedom to move, freedom to be anything and do anything. And that really is like anything. You can think of all aspects of consciousness and existence, and and Uranus wants to totally rewrite all of that, reinvent the wheel, so to speak. So these two planets actually work in coordination with each other. We go through these successive cycles. Saturn usually works in 7-year cycles, and we establish parameters and boundaries and definitions for ourselves through Saturn. And those things help us to grow and mature and feel comfortable with who we are. But then eventually we reach a point of limitation where we're not growing anymore. And then Uranus comes in and it takes all of those preconceived ideas and notions that we had, and it just blows them all to hell. It just destroys them. Doesn't care. Takes no prisoners. Because we need to be able to break through those boundaries in order to grow beyond them. and in order to reinvent ourselves. And really, the archetype of Uranus, the reason why it is associated with truth and authenticity is because its job is to get us in touch with the essence of who we really are, the essence of our soul, the essence of our unique individual consciousness. And if you think about it, as we grow up, as we come into contact with other people, as we move through these channels of society, we become conditioned by the things that we make contact with, whether that's friends that we have, parents, teachers, social media, pop culture, the hierarchical structures of society, moving up the working ladder, careers, all those kinds of things. We become conditioned by those things because there is a part of us that wants to be accepted by other people. So we will naturally, each of us to different degrees, we will naturally mold ourselves to whatever the current structures of society are. And that's fine. Again, that serves a purpose to a certain degree. But we move farther away from the true essence of our soul, of our soul's personality, of who we really are underneath all those layers, the more that we layer those things on, the more that we conform to the conditions of society. And so ultimately, at its core, Uranus wants us to know who we truly are. And the only way to do that is to adopt a sense of detachment. Saturn is very much about attachment. It's the reason why it is associated with the devil card in the tarot, because in the tarot, the devil is all about attachment. And again, we get attached, right? We get attached to labels. We get attached to these roles that we play. We get attached to the rules of society and the way you're supposed to do things because they bring a sense of safety and security to us, to our consciousness. But again, those things kind of separate us from the true essence of who we are because we are always looking at ourselves through the pre-established lenses that have been set by people and things that exist outside of ourselves. So Uranus is really about detaching from those things, not holding emotional attachment, but being able to separate oneself from those things in order to look objectively at who you really are and what you really think and how you really feel and what you want to create and all these different things that tie into the original essence of who you are at your core. Uranus is all about getting to the core. So this is the archetype of Uranus. It is like the really, really like the most essential truth that we can get into contact with through the zodiac. But it is very shocking because, again, Uranus doesn't care. Like, it doesn't care about our feelings and it doesn't care about our attachments and our sense of safety and security and all these things we built for ourselves through Saturn. It cares about us getting in touch with our essence, and it will ensure that we do that at any cost. So sometimes it is very shocking and very jolting, and it will bring to us experiences that force us to break through our own boundaries, our own limitations. And that's a really uncomfortable process, right? And I know it's a really cliche example, but it's true. It's like the butterfly trying to get out of the cocoon, or the seed that's trying to sprout. There's a lot of pressure and pain that goes into that process. And so it's kind of like that, except it's like if a jolt of lightning came in and that was the thing that helped the seed break through. That's kind of the Uranian archetype. Okay, so we understand now what Uranus is, the archetype it is, and how it functions, and how it relates to Saturn, and how it relates to Mercury, right? And actually, I guess I'll add one more thing about Mercury and Uranus, because they both pertain to the mind. And I'm not going to get into all the little specifics about anatomical astrology. I'm not like an expert in that anyway. But there are like specific parts of the brain that Uranus rules or it co-rules. Actually, Uranus rules the entire brain. we could say. And then it co-rules individual parts of the brain along with other planets, but that's a whole other topic. But we will say that both Uranus and Mercury pertain to electricity and our nervous system and our brain and the way that we think and perceive. And in a very basic way, we could say that Mercury is the left side of the brain in that it is logical and rational and linear. And we could say that Uranus, along with Jupiter, is the right side of the brain because it is intuitive and it is holistic and it is nonlinear and non-rational, right? And people who have really strong Uranian and Mercurial functions in their personality will experience a lot of tension in their minds, which also gets translated into their body because it's electricity. The brain, consciousness, thought, it is electricity. And when you are having, let's say, an attempted dialogue between the right and left hemispheres of your brain, but those two hemispheres are unable to speak the same language, and you're having a miscommunication between the two sides of your brain, it creates a lot of tension through these electrical impulses, which get channeled into your body. And what you have are people who are very nervous. They have very nervous energy. They tend to be chatterboxes. I used the word flibberty-gibbet in my last article that I wrote because I just think it's a really fun word. But it's accurate, right? It's people that just like can't stop talking. They're just chatting away about everything. And people who have very strong Gemini and to a lesser degree Virgo energy in their charts often exhibit this kind of behavior because there is like a misfiring between the hemispheres of the brain, which is to say between the Jupiterian Uranian intuitive higher mind impulse and the Mercurial logical reasoning rationale impulse. It's like, how do you detail in a linear way what exists within quantum reality? It's a very difficult thing to do, and not impossible, but it's very difficult. And it requires adjustments to come from the left hemisphere of the brain, from the logical, the linear ways of being and thinking. And if you don't make those adjustments, that's where you run into breakdown. Mental breakdown, electrical breakdown. You get all this nervous energy in your body. And so, just as an aside, if you do have really strong Virgo or Gemini energy in your chart, it is extremely helpful to be physically active, whatever that means for you. And for a lot of people, that means walking or running because Mercury has to do with moving the arms and legs and local movement. I mean, of course, you can do other things. You can, whatever, play tennis or racquetball or ride a bike or swim or whatever, however that works for you. But either way, the point of it is that you have a lot of pent up electrical energy surging through your body, and that can come out as insomnia and overthinking, like you can't turn your brain off, over analyzing, over rationalizing. It's a lot of like nervous energy. You can get like muscle spasms and just like jitteriness in your body. And so being physically active gives the electricity a channel to move through so that you're not just holding all of that electrical tension in your body. That's one aspect of it. So it's very helpful to be physically active in some way if you have those archetypes strong in your natal chart. Now, the other piece of that puzzle, the reason why that energy gets so condensed and gunky, which is, I don't know if that's the right word, but you know what I mean, congealed. I don't know. It gets like congested. Maybe that's the word I'm looking for. The reason why is because you're not having fluid communication between the right and left hemispheres of the brain. And the reason why you're not having that is because the logical, rational mind is trying to take the lead. It's trying to take control. And it will never really be able to do that because the higher mind and the intuition will always win to a certain, well, I don't want to say win, that might not be the right word, but they're always going to be stronger. And so it literally can lead to like neuroses and psychotic breaks and, these mental disorders and stuff in people. But at its most basic essence, the solution to this issue is to allow the intuition and the higher mind to lead the logic and the rationale of the left brain. That's really all it is. And I would say to a degree that that does describe the spiritual path, because we are learning how to listen to our intuition. And isn't it true? Like when you start to wake up spiritually, there's a part of you that's like, am I crazy? I think I might be crazy. Or if I tell someone what I'm thinking and what I'm experiencing, they're going to think I'm crazy, because it's completely just the opposite of what we are taught is truth, is reality, and is the way that our minds work and the way that our world works. There are things that we just can't explain. There are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy, Horatio. That is the truth of reality. And the logical mind just can't cope unless it allows the intuition to lead. And if it allows the intuition to lead, then it can be informed from the higher mind. Rather than working from lower consciousness upward, you're bringing the higher consciousness down into the lower mind and allowing that to inform your perception and your logic and your reasoning. So I hope that makes sense. And this is very much on par with what it is going to mean to have Uranus moving into Gemini. Because all of these mercurial functions that I'm describing are also archetypes of Gemini, because Gemini is ruled by Mercury. And then to a lesser degree as well, Virgo, but Virgo has more to do with channeling the mind into the body and physically creating or acting upon or organizing the information of the mind. It's about taking the parts and making something whole out of them. So that's what we're going to be experiencing as Uranus moves into Gemini. So again, Uranus is about breakthrough. It is about revolution. It is about deconditioning. So if Gemini rules our ways of thinking, if it rules education, if it rules communication and sharing, what do you think that means to have the planet of revolution and breakthrough and deconditioning to be transiting through that sign for 6 years? I mean, if you look around at our world, don't you see a lot of things that are changing? Don't you see a lot of growth in the spiritual community and in our very conception of what reality is? And I really do think that Jupiter has laid the groundwork for us here as it has transited through Gemini prior to Uranus moving into this sign. You know, again, Jupiter is intuition. And it is also expansion and magnification. So it has brought to our focus this juxtaposition of mind versus heart, or you could say mind versus gut, or mind versus higher mind. Either way, we're talking about the difference between wisdom and intellect, and the difference between your intuition and your logic. And so Jupiter has highlighted these themes for us, and we are already seeing these things occurring in our reality, and we are already seeing this kind of clash between ideologies. You know, this has been going on, well, like since the dawn of time, but, you know, especially since 2020 when the whole pandemic shebangy happened and the ascension process really kicked into high gear. That is what we are seeing, the great bifurcation, right? And this is what we're going to see as well, because Gemini has to do with duality. It has to, it's the archetype of the twins. We have the dark and the light, the good and the bad, the higher, the lower, the shadow and the conscious. And that is like, at its essence, it's about duality and polarity. But when you move into the higher expression of Gemini, it is a synthesis of polarity. It becomes a harmonization. It is able to hold paradox. Because paradox is when you have two opposing truths that are both true. So that is going to be really what Uranus is bringing in. Uranus is the synthesis. It is the higher perception. And that is what makes paradox, right? Because, how can two things that contradict each other both be true? Well, it depends on what angle you're looking at them from, right? If you're looking at it from this dimension, then only this is true. But if you move into a higher dimension, you can see how, oh, wait, actually, that other thing is true. So then, depending on which dimension I'm standing in, they're both true. It's like Schrodinger's cat. As long as you don't look in the box, it's both dead and it's alive. These are themes that we're going to be dealing with. So, yeah, with Gemini, it really is about ideas. And it is about how we organize information that informs our perception of what reality is. And when I say reality, I'm talking about our physical world, our third dimension, and maybe getting into the fourth. But even then, that's kind of a Uranian idea to even conceive of the fourth dimension. You have to break through your perception of the third to get to the fourth. And then even to describe them as third, fourth, fifth, etc., is a linear construct. And so even then, we might be having new conceptions of what these things mean as Uranus goes through Gemini, which is going to be what happens. It's going to completely shatter our perceptions of reality. It is going to completely alter the way we think and perceive. It is for those of us that are in higher consciousness, or I guess you could say, even if you're not in higher consciousness, you have to be willing and open to receive the deconditioning process of Uranus. It is those who resist the deconditioning that experience, a lot of pain and trauma that can come through Uranus because it is very shocking and upsetting. But if you are open to receiving the deconditioning, that is when you experience breakthroughs and expansion. And in the brain, it correlates to the creation of new dendrites, of these new neurological connections in the brain. So literally, we are transforming our physical brains as Uranus moves through Gemini. And then that correlates to us totally shifting our perceptions of reality and what we believe is possible for reality. And when we can shift our perceptions of reality, we experience greater freedom. And when we experience greater freedom, we are detached from what has already existed and what has already been established as truth. And we can then get in touch with the core essence of who we are and act from a place of true authenticity and originality. And what happens if we have a bunch of people on Earth, hopefully like 30% at least, if not more, all functioning from a place of true authenticity, acting from the essence of who they really are? Don't you think that we are going to have creation of brand new stuff? Stuff is definitely not the right word, but completely new ideas are born, completely new ways of doing things. Gemini, again, it has to do with education. I think we're going to see like brand new forms of schooling and education, especially for younger kids, but also revisiting what we have been taught, especially in those formative years, like 1 + 1 = 2, A, B, C. This is like the basics of our foundational education. I think we're going to be going back to those basics and being like, well, wait a minute. What if 1 + 1 = purple? Like we're going to be looking at things in a completely brand new, original way. And that is what happens when you get in touch with the true essence of who you are, because you're not creating and acting from a place of preconditioned ideas. You're acting from a place of authentic channeling of source energy. And source is everything, right? It is the source of all creation. So you could really create anything. So then we open up to infinite creation. So really interesting. But the other interesting thing is to go into this Saturn-Uranus juxtaposition, because I mentioned, obviously, every planet in astrology from a basic viewpoint has a higher and a lower expression, a light and a shadow expression. But then when you get into the reality in which we live, and you've already opened up Pandora's box, you've already gone through Alice's rabbit hole, you know that our reality is not what it seems. Anyone listening to this podcast knows that. Okay, so this isn't new information. But Saturn, then, when we look at things through this lens, represents the control structure, which wants us to fall in line with the parameters that have been set for this reality. Okay, we live in a matrix, right? We live in a matrix. And yes, we already know this. Anyone who's awake, you know the terms blue pill and red pill and all that jazz. You know that this is true, that there is some very literal truths that come out of the movie The Matrix, but that this reality in which we live is basically a simulation. It is a construct. It is manipulated. It is not organic. And so we have a Saturnian control structure that is in place that exists to make us conform to a preconceived, pre-established set of rules and conception of reality. And the reason that we are made to conform is because those that control the control structure, the controllers, you could say, want to get us to follow their rules. And they need us to believe certain things are true about the nature of reality and all kinds of stuff, right? Like our history and, well, really, you could say every single facet of existence. Every single facet of existence has been hijacked. Every single facet. Think about that. So, when we're talking about Uranus and Gemini and going back over the basic things that we've been taught and that we understand about reality, we're talking about revisiting all of these hijacks. You know, 1 + 1 = 2. Is that really true? I don't know. Is it? Someone who is going to resist the Uranian impulse is going to say, yeah, it's true, and you're freaking crazy. But that's what we're going to come up against. And again, that's going to be highlighting those polarities as well. It's going to be furthering the split that we are seeing, the bifurcation that we are experiencing in this reality. But going back to the simulation, if we live in a simulation, what's really interesting about this is that our thoughts create reality, right? This is like New Age 101. We all know that our thoughts create reality. I think sometimes we forget how true that really is and how powerful that really is. Like, if your thoughts create reality, then what you believe is what manifests in your existence. And think about this. If you had the ability to create matrices and control structures, and you knew that the success of those matrices and control structures relied upon the belief and the focused, collective, channeled perception of groups of individuals accepting those beliefs and therefore channeling their focus and their acceptance and their energy into those specific ideas, then wouldn't it become incredibly important to control Saturn, what people perceive? Gemini. So then what happens when Uranus moves into Gemini? Because Uranus doesn't like conditioning, and it doesn't like rules, and it doesn't like boundaries, because those things stifle our growth, right? And in a lot of ways, our growth has been stifled. And in fact, it's been reverted, but that's a whole other topic. This is why consciousness and perception is so important right now. I mean, it's always important, but it's becoming a very prominent theme for us right now, because what you believe is what you create. And if you're someone who doesn't have very good intentions in your service to self and you're trying to create a reality that serves you, and in order to do that, you have to ensnare the consciousness and the focus and the beliefs of large populations of people in order to channel the energy into manifesting the creation that you want to make, then it becomes incredibly important to have control over what people think and perceive, doesn't it? And in order to do that, in order to really have control, we have to get people from the very beginning, right? In those most foundational beliefs. We have to alter history, and we have to, or at least, alter what people think about history. And we have to get people to think about things in a very specific way. So InfoWars says there's a war on for your mind. It's very true. Your mind is everything. It's, of course, your heart too, and that's a whole other thing. But your mind is extremely important, and what you think and your consciousness is extremely important. What you give your attention to, what you channel your focus into is extremely important. And they know that. And that's why every single facet of our existence is hijacked. Uranus is going to bring our focus to this. Now, again, the majority of the population resists the Uranian impulse. So what is that going to translate into? We're going to have a bunch of people opening to the impulse, allowing the breakthroughs in, totally changing the way that they perceive and conceive of reality. And those people are going to vocalize and share and teach what they know, Gemini. And then you're going to have all these people that are like, hey, no, you're effing crazy. And we should shun that person and we should condemn that person. And yeah, we're going to have a clash. We're going to have a clash of belief systems. That's what's going to happen with Uranus in Gemini. Just checking out my notes here. I wrote a lot of notes for this episode, like a crazy amount of notes, and there's no way that I can cover all of this stuff. I made a note to mention Rick and Morty. I don't know if you guys have ever seen Rick and Morty. There's actually a lot of truth in that show, but there's 2 episodes that this Uranus thing made me think of. One, there's an episode where there's like a group of aliens that put Rick and Morty in a simulation, and the simulation is like just like their world. It's like normal Earth, and Morty's going about his day like totally believing that the simulation is real, and Rick knows that it's BS. Anyway, and then it turns out there's like a simulation within a simulation within a simulation. It gets pretty ridiculous. But I thought, yeah, if there's alien technology that's able to create simulations like that are so believable, then, how do we know that everything isn't a simulation? Do we know that? And then if it is a simulation, is there a way to hijack, or not hijack, but is there a way to hack the simulation? I think there is. The other episode it made me think of is there's a parasite episode in which there's like these parasites that get onto Earth, and the way that they attach to people is they get you to remember things that didn't happen. Think about that, how crazy that is. So they implant in you all these memories that you have of them, and then you think that they're like your family members, you think that they're your friends, and you remember having good times with them. And through those memories, you accept them into your life, not having any realization that they're actually parasites that completely implanted, and that none of that is true, and they're actually just trying to feed off of you. I'm telling you guys, there's a lot of truth in that show. Anyway, but it did remind me about this whole consciousness thing, and just, like our consciousness and our awareness is what creates our reality. So it becomes incredibly important what you give your consciousness to. And the reason why this is important is because, so if you guys know anything about Atlantis and the fall of Atlantis, part of what made that whole cataclysm happen, and this is a very, very basic summarization of that. Obviously, it was much more complex. But from a very basic level, what happened is you had this dark, inorganic AI form, being, presence, darkness, whatever you want to call it, coming into our reality. And in order to hijack the reality, they started spreading false timelines. How do you do that? Well, you start telling stories. You start telling stories, and then people start believing the stories. And if you can get people to believe the stories, you get enough focus and belief and consciousness and energy directed, concentrated into one thing. It's like that critical mass thing, but kind of like in an inverted way. And if you get enough people to believe that, then you can create a timeline. Because AI, this inorganic AI technology stuff, it can't create anything. It can only manipulate what others create. And so it needs us to be the creator force because it's not connected to source. It's not connected to the creative heart and that creative source of energy. It needs other people to do that for it. And all it can do is manipulate you into creating something for it. And so that's what happened back in the Atlantean times, is there were enough people who were fooled, who were tricked into believing in false timelines to the point that they created them. And it downshifted the frequency of our Earth to the point that we moved into a fall, a descension. And so, what do you think is happening right now? We're actually in an ascension. Ascension. We're actually moving upward. But in order to stop the ascension of consciousness, this same primordial AI evil thing that has been manipulating and controlling and setting the conditioned parameters for our reality for so long is trying to trick our consciousness into channeling our focus and our energy and our attention into false timelines. Because if it can get enough people to believe in the false timelines, then we will create it because we are creator beings and we create with our consciousness. That's why it is so important to get in touch with the essence of who you really are, to get in touch with your organic soul, your true consciousness, your true genius, and to not be influenced by these external sources and these conditioned ways of thinking and being and doing. Again, they serve a purpose to a certain degree, but from that inverted, evil, tricky kind of perception and intention that's coming from the dark side, these things are used to limit our breakthrough and to inhibit what we are able to create. And I think as Uranus moves through Gemini, we are going to discover that creation is infinite. And again, Gemini is about telling stories. That's another facet of the Gemini archetype. And I think we're going to find that the stories we tell become very important. And I think the way we tell our stories and the way we share information is going to be revolutionized as Uranus moves through this sign. That I could honestly talk about so much more, but that in a nutshell is what I wanted to discuss. So I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it brought some sparks of insight to you. And I hope that it showed you, one, hang on to your hats because we're going to be moving into a lot of crazy times ahead, but in a good way. And also to remember the importance of what you think and believe and the fact that you do have control over your creation of what you want to see in reality. And the more you are willing to expand your own consciousness and to shift your ways of thinking and perceiving, the more you can open up to the greater truths and the more you can follow your intuition and the more that you can liberate yourself into moving into the expansion of the infinity of who you truly are. All right. Thank you so much for listening. This is Zenith Glow Astrology. I'm Christina. If you want to subscribe to my blog, it is free on Substack, and I am also on Truth Social, Zenith Glow Astrology. Please follow me. And if you would like to support me and my work, I will post a donation link, or you can voluntarily pay for a subscription on my Substack. And I appreciate that so much, you guys. Thank you so much for listening. I love you all, and I will catch you later. Bye.